let me take the opportunity to briefly introduce New Acropolis. We are an international organization with presence in over 60 countries. And we've been in India since last 14 years. We work with three pillars. New Acropolis works with three pillars of philosophy, culture, and volunteering. And the basic endeavor is towards new and a better human being so that we can serve the world in the best way we possibly can. Yeah, so we, first of all, we are 100% volunteer run organization. So everyone you see here is a volunteer. And the emphasis, I would say, is that we not only talk about and learn about and understand philosophy, understand different cultures, different traditions through the world, but the emphasis is putting this understanding, this philosophy, this knowledge into practice. For it to go from something that I know about to something that I become. And this is the bridge that we are constantly trying to bridge in a very, very humble, small way to live philosophy, to allow philosophy to have an impact on my day-to-day action, on our day-to-day action, on our day-to-day thoughts, on our choices, on our priorities, on our being. And all the sessions that we do under the umbrella of Culture Circle are in some way related to this direction, to discover who we truly are and to take certain practical understanding from each session so that I can allow it to change who I am for the better. Sometimes we call it change, but sometimes it's almost like I can peel off what I'm not. I can let go of what I'm not in order to truly become who I am. Yeah, and this New Acropolis Culture Circle, which is hosting this event today, is more related to the cultural pillar of Acropolis, and we host many cultural events through the every month, multiple events every month, and to celebrate and investigate culture with a philosophical lens, to see culture as collective wisdom of humanity, to see it as a human legacy, and to investigate culture from this point of view, this perspective. I would like to introduce Adam Williamson, who has very generously agreed today to be a part of our sessions and to lead our session titled Sacred Geometry, an exploration of profound patterns found in art, architecture, and nature. Even from the few sentences that he spoke at the beginning of this session, we get a glimpse on who Adam is. He is somebody who is searching, exploring patterns, again, not just at a superficial aspect of visual, but to see some connection with the whole. He's has been commissioned by very, very prestigious entities like His Royal Highness Prince of Wales, Oxford University, Shakespeare Globe in London, to just name a few. And we are very grateful and happy to have you, Adam. And
Thank you.
I hand over the stage to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janki. And yeah, I think it's a fantastic point about that balance between practice and theory, and I started with the practice, and it's almost like the practice itself gave me that understanding, because there's a sort of limit to how much you can theorize. And often when I work with craftsmen, when I'm traveling, there's they have whether I'm working in Morocco or in Malaysia, they're all, as we were discussing with the patterns on the carpet, they're all interlinked and they all have the same approach, but they can't explain what they're doing. It's just a given. And they sort of almost look at you like, well, where beauty is, what is archetypal, what is absolute. We all agree this is beautiful, you know. It's only in the West that we've got so far, you know, and you can see in the contemporary art world, we've got so far from that archetypal beauty that we're having to almost sort of destroy it, you know, to refine it, and it's very complicated. So I hope today, my intention is that I can share something that's fresh, or even just a reminder for everyone of how pattern can help in our lives. So I like to start my sessions with a little quote by my teacher, Keith Critchlow, who really brought all of these elements together. It's a little invocation prayer. So, may we all be guided by truth, may we have beauty revealed to us, and may it result in the good. I'll give a little bit of a background about myself. So I've always been interested in pattern. I've grown up with a father who was a carpenter, and parents who were interested in Sufism and various spiritual approaches. And I think I was sort of hardwired from a young age to focus, you know, more on application, like you're saying, on practice, which was a bit difficult at school. My parents weren't so fussed about academia, about any of those elements. And so as soon as I left home, I wanted to find people with skills. So I traveled all over the world looking for master craftsmen. And it wasn't necessarily in this romantic study in the jungle kind of experience. I was looking for practical skills. And what I didn't realize was that you learn so much more from these masters, because there's something about a craftsman that's ascetic. You know, they've given up certain desires to be a craftsman, and to really put in those thousands of hours and to really see into the work and to really reveal it. You have to remove yourself from society in a way, from the normal kind of currents of like daily wants and needs. And I mean, that's the sort of gift that these patterns give, these practices give, that I've been trying to share, you know, in my classes. But I didn't really understand that at the time. It was just something that I felt good doing, and I wanted to know how to do it. So this is Nurhaiza Nuruddin, who I studied with in Malaysia. He taught me a lot about wood carving and pattern and biomorphic pattern. And then, as you mentioned, I worked for about 10 years throughout my 20s as a sculptor, as a stone carver. I started more as a calligrapher, but then it moved more into carving, restoration, and various projects for different areas of society. And then slowly, without realizing, I slipped into running these study trips. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but we were teaching in my studio, and then we were like, we need to really go to the source and take everyone to the source and learn from the craftsmen. And I was kind of facilitating these trips to Morocco and Turkey and Esfahan. And that really, I mean, there's something about teaching that really makes you need to know, you know, you really have to join up the dots. See, like, if you're a craftsman or a carver, it's like you're a sort of mechanic or something, you know, you can understand like how the functions of a certain vehicle, but when you have to relay that to someone else, you're then going to have to go and, you know, you're going to have to anticipate, or you'll start receiving questions. Well, where was the Ford car from, or where was the, you know, and you really need to. So there's something fantastic about teaching and facilitating these things, where all the questions, and that's what I imagine at the end of this talk too. I always find that's when it almost gives me a new direction of research. It's like, like this sort of just shows holes in your understanding. And so I've got a lot to thank for the position I was put in to run these trips. And I really had to learn a lot more and learn my craft and skill and learn and understand what it was, what the beauty was behind these processes that we go through. So since the lockdown, I had to, you know, we were all grounded, and then I went online, and I've just been teaching all of these classes online. So that's been the last year, and it's been a fantastic journey, and that has its own benefits too, because we're connected, you know, throughout the world, you know, people who can't afford to travel or just can't afford to pay, you know, we just did this all on a sort of donation basis, and it's been a really beautiful experience. It's connected so many of us, and I really see this whole lockdown as a, you know, it's been a long time coming, really. I mean, obviously there's a lot of tragedy, I mean, but as far as the sort of global psyche, I think that we were kind of pushing it for a long time with the way we lived in the world, and it's good that we've had this time to really check in, for so many reasons. You know, I mean, you just imagine when we are allowed out again, and just how we all appreciate the beauty of the world that we live in. And it's all about appreciation and gratitude. And I think sometimes you need it to be taken away to really see what you have. So some beautiful results from these classes. You know, people would take the class and then go away and spend hours rendering the patterns. And this is something that couldn't happen outside of this lockdown experience. So I feel it's a really special time. I mean, unbelievable skills that I've been witnessing. Okay, so I'd like to kind of wrap this talk around this diagram, which I've been thinking about recently, and I'll explain it in more detail later. But if we're going to talk about sacred geometry, we really need to talk about the sacred geometry. For me, is really, it's like our way of accessing divine knowledge in a scientific, rational way. So this is a way that we can understand nature, we can understand the sort of divine code through our minds, you know. And this is something that, like I was saying, craftsmen, other cultures don't necessarily need to worry. They just have it, they embody it. But we're in the West, you know, not in the West, everyone, you're like yourselves, you know, we're sort of battling with trying to understand instead of just trying to experience and feel. And so I love this diagram, and I'll explain a little bit more about this as we go on. So recently I've been fascinated with this connection between like the sort of like the masculine and the feminine qualities within pattern and art. And they could be maybe described by, you know, masculine lines, you know, direct movement, and then this more meandering curves of the spirals. And these are the sort of things I've been investigating privately for the last few months for some carving projects I've been working on called Changing Patterns. And it's all about this movement of spirals. I've been looking very much into old, like these are sort of diagrams from like nautical maps and various academic researches, as well as looking at obviously the logarithmic spirals. But there is this oscillation throughout pattern in all traditions between the geometric, the sort of masculine straight, and then the more fluid curvilinear forms and the relationship between them. So I've been very much interested more in the sort of feminine curvilinear aspects, this fluid movement, but it needs a structure, it needs a functional foundation underneath it, which we'll start to investigate. This is just a really sort of like a mood board to kind of give you a sense of my view of this biomorphic form, which you'd see in art, in the kind of arabesque curvilinear forms that we draw, which are found in all sacred geometry in different traditions. And it's this flow of water, right? So Lao Tzu says it so well: what's softest in the world rushes over what's hardest in the world, like a river rushing over the rocks. And anyone who dances or moves or practices any martial arts, they'll understand that, you know, whether it's Lindy Hop dance or any kind of form, you know, like it's all about like give and pull and push, and all about spirals and all about momentum. And this is, our bodies are completely not, we'll talk about this later, our bodies are full of these proportions, but also in the movements we make, the grace of our gait, you know, the grace of our movement, the closer we get to these golden proportion movements. And you kind of find it if you've ever practiced ecstatic dance. So it could just be like putting on something in your kitchen and dancing wildly, but you know that when you really are in abandon, you are moved by the music in that way and that frequency. You are kind of, if you were to really view your movements, I think the closer you get to that abandon, I think the closer you are to moving in a kind of golden formation. So this is how I'd relate those movements to the kind of biomorphic practice that I do, or that's been done by many craftsmen around the world. So there's sort of an image of this whirlpool and the spirals that flow between them. This is also an image from this Soleimani Mosque Jami in Istanbul. It's a window, but it very much shows how you have these three interlocking sine wave spirals, which are the basis for the pattern. So movement and nature. What we're going to look at is how you can take a snapshot of nature, and you can obviously see the spirals, but nature grows in these golden proportions. It's all about the movement and growth. And we're always trying to sort of freeze frame everything, but actually it's all about that movement, that flow. There's a fantastic book, which I can put in the chat box later, by Rudolf Schwenk, who's a sort of anthroposophist. It's basically linked to kind of Rudolf Steiner and that movement, but he did all these incredible researches into flow, and his book is called Sensitive Chaos, and it's all about this movement that you find in nature. Okay, so this is, for example, you see that I picked these because they're sort of quite arbitrary, but you know, the connection between seed pods in nature and the movement of bird wings, or the spirals found just in the draw of oxygen, you know, from the trees into the plains of a forest, you know, clearing in a forest, and up and down and around again. And there are these currents and eddies and thermal currents going on everywhere, you know, somatic vibrations, and it's all geometry. It's all flow and geometry. That's beautiful. As I was saying that, it's just started to snow here. And this flow, when you connect it to sort of craftsmanship, is very important. You know, the flow that you find within living nature, for example, within the movement of sap through a tree, this needs to be respected when you're carving the wood. So like they say, you need to carve with the grain, you know, don't go against the grain. And that is very important as a craftsman. You need to flow with the vital force and the movement and the flow of this living material. So there are patterns behind the patterns. So when you're in sacred spaces, it's, and I can remember when I was more of a layman myself as a teenager, going to the Alhambra Palace, going to places and not really understanding what I was seeing, but being affected by them. And I always try and remember that now that I kind of nerd out more and try and understand what's going on behind the patterns. But you are elevated by these patterns, and there is a lot of sort of intuitive work that goes on with patterns that really hit a spot within the heart. So this is this is from the Lutfala Dome in Esfahan. It's a very famous mosque, which was actually built only for females. And this I show, and I've shown many times before, is a fantastic example of sacred numerology, and kind of raises questions of whether these artists knew what they were doing or whether they were just inspired. So this has a certain number of shamsas, which are the circles, or the shamsas represented in the bottom right-hand corner. And they relate to the womb. So when you look at it's called, I won't go into it in too much detail, but it's called the Abjad value. So the sacred numerology behind equates to Al-Rahim, which is the womb. And this cupola dome has this womb-like quality. And whether these artists were using this formula, like Leonardo used the golden proportion, or whether they were just divinely inspired, it's the same effect, you know. But there are so many secrets behind these things, but I feel like we just know what is beauty when we see it. This is an example of cymatics. So this is the movement, oscillation of liquid with a dye in it. And there's another form of displaying this exercise where you can oscillate a salt or a sand on a piece of slate, and it will shift into different patterns. And this is just to show how as we were saying, there are patterns not just in the invisible thermal currents and the movements and the eddies, but also in sound and vibration. So this is a very good example of that, cymatics. Symmetry is found all over nature. So here we just have examples of 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s. And symmetry is very important. It's this kind of, we are all one, but there is this almost we need a mirror, we need duality. Without like the other, it's very difficult to know who we are. So we have this constant push and pull. And I like Rumi's explanation of that. So God turns you from one feeling to another and teaches you by means of opposites, so that you will have 2 wings to fly, not one. This is an example from a ritual that's undertaken by Borneo tribesmen, and they use a stick. It's called a rite of orientation. And they take the shadow, and then with a string, they'll draw the cardinal directions as a way to find out where they are using the sun. And geometry basically just means earth measure. And it was sort of coined, due to the way that the ancient Egyptians would measure with the chain the flood banks after the water had receded on the Nile. And it's a fantastic, perfect explanation of what it is. It's not this nerdy thing that you use to sort of, draw a hinge. It's actually a very important process. This is just a beautiful example of the Mesquita facade and all the beautiful geometry that's going on within this facade. So that it's, when you're looking at pattern, often artists working, on sacred spaces, on sanctuaries, would be dividing up the surface firstly into golden proportion. So, the heights between the arches and the span, the niches, all of those elements would relate to the elements within the patterns themselves. So there's a lot of consideration that goes into building these monuments. You've probably heard of famous stories with the Chartres Cathedral, where the rose window, there's a big stained glass rose window at the front of Chartres Cathedral in France, and then on the floor there's a labyrinth, a big circle with a maze with a labyrinth on it. But if you were to collapse the front of the building, it would land so that the window fit perfectly on the labyrinth itself. So these things are all connected, and there would be a connectedness between the elements, the modular elements of the pattern, and the larger ground plan of the building. So this is an example. This is from one of the classes we were working on last year. It's the frontispiece, and it's just showing that relationship, how you'll have the geometry and the biomorphic elements, and then underneath those biomorphic elements you'll always have this framework, whether it's just dividing up a radial circle, right down to drawing the spirals of the compass. And underneath you'll have different symmetry groups. So the simplest way to tessellate these patterns will be using regular tiling, which would be either hexagons, squares, or triangles, and it's an example of that used in nature. When we look at bee honeycombs, these have incredible structural values. The triangle is used. I mean, if anyone who's done any kind of building work, without a triangle, you're going to use a lot of material. It has incredible properties. And this just gives you an example of how those particular grids help these patterns tessellate. So you can see in black here, this is from the Aturan Madrasa. In black, you have the hexagon, and this is the underlying grid that's used to repeat this pattern. And that gets more and more complex. This is a pattern from the Alhambra Palace, and you can see within the main rosette, which is outlined in black, you have further fractal patterns within. So you have a sort of subdivision. So there's patterns within patterns. And this is a very good example of what happens in nature. So we're going to talk a little bit about geometry in nature now. It's a fantastic Fibonacci cactus. So many of these ideas were first noted down by Pythagoras, even though people knew about them way before. And this is an example of Pythagoras. This is a picture by Raphael of Pythagoras and Aristotle, his student. And I'll just read Keith's little quote. So Keith was my teacher, about relatedness and relationship. But first, what he's saying at the top there is basically there are these proportions, and there is a particular proportion that when you take one part and add it to the other part, it relates to one of those parts in its whole. And this is what we're going to get onto. But this whole idea of relationship is beautiful. And relatedness or relationship is the key to understanding what golden mean and golden meaning is all about. To strike a golden mean relationship is to get closer to the truth, which in turn can indicate the unity of the whole universe. And that's what we're aiming at, really. It's just like you were saying, Janki, at the beginning, is to understand why we're here, what we're doing, what our path is, what's the truth, what's going on. So this is a little bit from a little image from the wooden books, which are published by John Martineau, and fantastic if you haven't come across these. So the golden proportion, it's 1 to 1.618, and you can see it very clearly in the pentagram in the bottom left. The pentagram is full of the golden proportion, and 5 is very important. I mean, we're all based on 5, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. 5 appears everywhere. And the smaller to the larger is always within that golden proportion. And then on the right, we just have some examples of the heavenly bodies, of the movements of the planets and how they relate to the golden proportion. And here's some examples of the golden proportion used in architecture, especially back in the classical period and the Renaissance, in the neoclassical periods too. They would always try and implement the golden proportion, but it was also used as an inspiration too, which I'll show you in more like impressionist paintings in later days. And this is just also some examples on the right here of how the golden proportion relates within the human body. And that's like a whole, you could spend hours and hours discussing how the body is completely full of the golden proportion, just the elements of your finger, and then your finger to your hand, and then your hand to your elbow, and your elbow to your shoulder, all full of golden proportion, no matter how big or small we are. The size of our teeth, the distance of our eyes. It's incredible. And I used to always carry golden proportion calipers, which I would take to schools when I taught there. And as soon as you get the children up, you get a really tall one, and then you get a small one, and you measure them with the calipers, and they're all golden, and they're just, the kids go crazy for it. It's like, it's magic, it's sorcery. And it is, it's really, these are ways that we can really marvel at the human body. It's not just a mistake. So this just shows some more use in artwork of the golden proportion. And you can see Leonardo was very aware of the golden proportion. He'd worked a lot with the Platonic solids, and he would have very much implemented it in his work. But then if you look at the Impressionist artists like Cézanne, and it was just a natural, so you'd naturally put the horizon on the golden proportion. You'd naturally divide these things up if you have an artistic eye. You wouldn't necessarily need to be like calculating it in that way. Here's some more examples from nature of the golden proportion, just to kind of inspire you. I like this this guy in the top left. Look at those eyes. Okay, so we're going to now look at the Fibonacci spiral. It's the sunflower head. There are 2 logarithmic spirals in this sunflower, and we're going to talk about those relationships. So if you're not familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, it's very simple. You just take a number and add it to the previous one. So if you were to start from 0, you'd be 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1 and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, 5 and 8 is 13, and so forth. But you could start from 2. You could start from another number. This is just how the sequence unfolds from 0. And then this is found in nature in so many different ways. So again, like, I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot, but you can see how a tree bifurcates, different stages, but also the number of branches. This is one way of looking at it. And then to connect the Fibonacci sequence to the golden proportion, you need to return back to that diagram that I showed you at the beginning. So what's happening here, and this is something that I've always been really fascinated about, because this diagram is like our search for perfection, right? You know, because we never get there in the way, right? It's never ending. So this is the Fibonacci sequence. And if you divide those elements of the Fibonacci sequence, you get closer and closer to the golden proportion. So you get closer and closer, you know, to 1.618. And you can see that in the line at the bottom. But if you were to take a magnifying glass and zoom in to like the little section on the right, it would be the same. That diagram would always look the same. If you kept zooming in, the oscillation would always continue, right? It would never, it never aligns. And this is that constant, right? This is where we're heading. It's sort of never ending search for perfection. And the way it wraps around that line is perfect. And so that's the connection between it. And you can see it in pine cones or pineapples. They have these two spirals. So if we take a pine cone, you have 8 spirals going in one direction, which is a Fibonacci number, and then 13 going in the other. But if we were to isolate the spirals and look at the logarithmic spirals themselves, at the very core of the spirals, it's quite chaotic, right? So you often see at the beginning of a pine cone, it's a little bit chaotic, but as they get further out, they get closer and closer to the Fibonacci sequence. The spiral gets tighter and tighter. And it's a little bit like nature, you know, you kind of like, you know, the seed's born, we're in this world. And then like, as it grows towards the light, it gets more and more divine. It gets closer and closer to that perfection. And that's an example of the spiral and how they relate. And you'll find it in our DNA. We can go on and on about how this occurs and where it occurs. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about three-dimensional geometry. So there are 5 Platonic solids within, so Platonic solid is named after Plato, but as you can see from these examples here, there are examples from 1,000 years before Plato was around. So they're assigned to him because he was the first person to speak about them. But they're basically, if you take any polygon, if you take a polygon, like a triangle, a square, or a pentagon, and join up all the edges, you can only make 5 shapes. And that is, you got the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the cube, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. And these are very important. They have a lot of knowledge within them. So there are only 5 shapes where, you know, as I said, all the edges are the same, all the points touch the inside of a sphere. Now, before we go any further, I'd just like to show you this really interesting diagram that John Martineau produced. As we said at the beginning, there are 3 regular tilings. So there are only 3 shapes that will tile like this. That's shapes that go to fit together like a jigsaw without any gaps in between. And then there are 5 Platonic solids, like we just discussed. There are only 5 of these. There are not 4, no, not 6. And then there are 8 shapes. There are 8 semi-regular tilings. So that's when you take 2 different polygons and put them together. And then there are only 13 Archimedean solids where you take 2 shapes to create a sphere. And that itself is the Fibonacci sequence. You got 3, 5, 8, 13. So you can go crazy and find these forms everywhere, but they keep appearing, and you know, your mouth drops further and further to the table. This is an example of Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of a dodecahedron. He was fascinated in these forms and what they had to teach. And then these forms, as our friend was saying at the beginning from Bhutan, I think, are related to the elements. So octahedron air, cube earth, tetrahedron fire, dodecahedron the universe or ether, and the icosahedron water. Now, what's really interesting, and we could go into this in great depth in the future, but each of these shapes, you know, in lots of traditions are seen in this way. So many people, like from, you know, Japan to Aboriginal to like the Native Americans, that, you know, they'll see the square as earth and the circle as heaven, you know, the triangle as fire. So these are assigned, but they're sort of embodied. And then they have these incredible relationships. So you can break the 5 into two groups. You have the octahedron and the cube, and they are jewels of each other. So they relate, they subdivide within each other. And then I don't have another example, but the same thing happens with the icosahedron, the dodecahedron. The only one that doesn't is the tetrahedron, because that just multiplies with itself. You know, if you've seen lots of those triangular based pyramids, they just multiply. This is a beautiful example of the movement of the planets. So this is Earth and Venus moving around over 8 years. So the 8 is a Fibonacci, and it creates this also Fibonacci 5-fold pattern. So there are all of these incredible discoveries that are coming in all the time. And I love it. This is from John's book called The Book of Coincidence, because he couldn't call it the book of sort of certainty because that wouldn't be accepted in science. But it is very coincidental that there are all these incredible connections. And then this is just a way that the icosahedron and these polyhedra are used to make contemporary architecture, like geodesic domes. And these domes were really originated by Buckminster Fuller. Now, I'll just show a couple more slides before we finish, but it would be nice to finish on Buckminster Fuller and Keith Critchlow, which is where we started, because Keith Critchlow was a student of Buckminster Fuller, and he was my teacher. But I just like this story, and it's the story of Buckminster Fuller. So I was just driving, listening to the radio, and you know, when you switch it on, you just come halfway through a story, and the story was about a man, and he was standing on a bridge, and he'd just lost his daughter. His daughter died, and his business had crashed, and he was standing on the bridge thinking, all right, I'm gonna throw it all away. You know, what do I have now? And then he thought, well, rather than doing that, I'm just gonna dedicate my time, the rest of my time on this earth, to people and to society and to understanding why we're here, you know. And like, I just thought, wow, what an incredible place. And I was listening more, and I was thinking, who is this guy? And that eventually was revealed that it was Buckminster Fuller. And so he's, you know, that's part of a very important lineage. And I feel like ultimately it's all about intention, you know, and to have that pure intention, I think that's why the universe like revealed all of its secrets to him, because he was coming from such a pure place. Okay, so thank you very much for, I could talk all day.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's really, really fascinating to go through your journey. You know, in a very, very short period of time, you give us a glimpse of some really like jewels. And I was just thinking that it, in some way, I guess the study of this teaches us to see patterns as blueprints of universe. You know, that's something like it's building blocks. And if it exists in nature, it also exists in me, because I'm a part of nature. And it shows us how deeply we are connected. You know, today we unfortunately see nature and me, you know, that nature is trees and mountains, and me as a human being is slightly separate. But this teaches us that we are all made of the same geometry. And this understanding for you will be very close to your heart, in the sense that it will be very deep, because you've been working with geometry for such a long time. Can you share with us how this impacted you as a human being, as your maybe change of a perspective, or shift in how you thought of the world?
Yes, well, this is the way that I understand the world, and the way that I can approach it, and sort of base my each step that I take. Yeah. And I mean, it's not to say that I'm not, you know, like I'm the same as everyone, making mistakes all the time, but my only way to sort of rationalize it, and the way that I can feel at peace is when I get these proofs, you know, like these signs. So as I say, when I started out, I didn't understand why. I just knew that when I was making work, when I was drawing, when I was carving, I was sort of like in a safe place, you know. It was an equilibrium. You know, it's not like a high or a low, or, you know, it's a beautiful equilibrium where you're in this, when you're in that space. And so I used to just seek out any opportunity to do incredibly arduous, long carving projects that people would thought I was crazy. But for me, like it was my atoms connected to the process, you know.
One more question is that in your other talks and things like that, you speak of arts and the sacred as a means to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that? What is the process that you follow, or why do you see it as a means of education?
It's sort of it's endless, and you know the sort of information that, and also completely simple, you know. And I think it's when you see those things, when you get that information, you can kind of relax because you know what it is. And when you have that trust, you're in a place of relaxation. You're not like, and when you relax into not being in control, but you know that there is a universal order, it's a place of relaxation. You can be like, oh, well, there's this there's a purpose, you know. This is like a lesson for me to learn, you know. And I think when you're rigid and you don't have that balance, and you're constantly feeling like you're in control and things are not working out because it's your fault, or because, you know, it's unfair and all of that, then it's not a nice place to be in. But when you understand the order of the universe, or you understand that it is an order, and it's obviously, it's easy for me to say that now, sitting in a warm apartment, you know, talking to you with a cup of tea, you know, like it's the hard times, you know, that like but in fact it's the hard times that is the only way out for me, you know, when you're really in a tough moment. And I like, okay, I can see it that way. So yeah, that's just how I see it. And like looking at sacred geometry, looking at nature, if you really stop and look at it and really contemplate it, it has all the wisdom you need, you know. And it's a wisdom that you just know, you know. And I know it sometimes because I try to ignore it. I know it's true because it's like I see it and I'm like, it's not always what I want to hear, but I and that's when you know that it's right.
I think the resonance of beauty, of goodness, of truth. We resonate with the sunset, or we resonate with a beautiful pattern, or even the way you said that when Cezanne painted, it was natural for him to draw his horizon at the perfect golden ratio. And why is that? Is probably because it's one. We are made of the same material, and that intelligence, or that beauty, or that harmony or proportion, or however we call it, also exists within me. So if I am trying to express myself as, I would say, transparently as I can, then maybe in some way I will harmonize with the whole, and I will harmonize with the beauty, or the archetype of beauty, in my own humble way.
Mm.
And I think we see that a lot with a lot of the sacred geometry, even the simple sketches that you shared. There is a very direct and quick resonance, that it's so beautiful. There's no is it beautiful, is it not beautiful, do I have an opinion, do I not have an opinion, does somebody else think it's beautiful? There's none of the intellectual questioning. There's just some resonance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We have another question. I think we have time for it. Anand Vasudevan asks, do you have any theories for why some ideas of beauty and shapes are universal across cultures and time horizons? For example, you mentioned that in cultures as diverse as Japan, Aboriginal, or Native American, the cube represents the earth, and tetrahedron the fire, etc.
I think this flows very much on from your statement, you know, about how, you know, people all connect to universal beauty, this archetypal beauty that we're trying to return to. It's found in nature, and I think this is the pearl, and the, you know, the irritating the pearl. Like, this is the trying to get, you know, this is the line on the, this is us trying to reach that, right? And so it's obvious that I feel many traditions back when they didn't have as much confusion as we have now, with all of the expectations we have, all of the I see it, you know, I see all these movies and I see social media, I see it all as like modern alchemy, you know, it's kind of like, you know, like sorcery, you know, and your attention's constantly being pulled away from the archetypes. If you can easily just, I think it is quite dangerous if you don't have a practice, then you can be washed away for the rest of your life. I mean, in the sort of just flowing around from back and forth, you know, in the ocean. And so, you know, like, to have a practice, you know, back in the day, when a lot of these traditional crafts are being produced, you know, they were living in a desert, they were living in the mountains, really connected to nature. So I feel like it's really obvious that they're going to come out with the archetypes, you know, and then those archetypes are all going to be mirrored across the world, or whatever they are. And I think that, I feel like lockdown has really helped everyone to really want to connect, because when you go through all of the watching, or you go through all the distractions, you know, ultimately, like, the only thing that really, like, quietens, you know, the mind and fulfills the soul are these practices. So
Yes, and I think unfortunately the distractions are very tempting. They're so attractive that it's hard for us to not be distracted from the thousand
yeah,
social media and external distractions,
yeah,
and we forget to hear our inner voice.
yeah. Well, because it's like short and long term, you know, it's like, you know, all practices are about patience, and the long term.
Yeah, yeah.
Short term is just like, just burns out, and, you know.
The excitement of yes, the emotional excitement of the short term versus
Yeah,
the
but then you get
contemplative
into
part.
the roller coaster, and you get into the peaks and lows, and
Yeah, yeah. Very, very heartfelt gratitude to you for sharing your time, sharing your journey with us. Most importantly, I think sharing who you are, because who you are reflects in what you say and what you do, in how you deal with patterns and how you look at life. And I think for philosophers, and I will say this from the point of view of Acropolis being a philosophical organization, for philosophers, I think living, breathing examples of those that are working hard, that are putting in the effort to dig a little bit deeper into what it means to be alive. Why am I here? What is my role in this universe? What is this connection that we speak about? Today we understand, we speak about this connection, that we are all connected, but to live with this perspective, and to make our choices and to make our priorities based on this knowledge is rare. And we are very, very happy, therefore, to see you as an inspiration and an example of doing exactly this.
thank
Thank you.